Back 4 Blood is a good but flawed game. I'm not sure if a video of this length can stand on such a simple introductory assessment, but what I do know is that that's the truth. Back 4 Blood is good, but it's also flawed. And another statement that I can confirm as fact is that this highly anticipated spiritual successor to the Left 4 Dead franchise has been a long time coming. Many fans of the genre have been eagerly awaiting its release through all the delays, and for good reason. It's not a stretch to call the Left 4 Dead franchise one of the most iconic in the history of online multiplayer, and the absence of a third game to round out the trilogy hasn't gone unnoticed by fans or developers. Back 4 Blood has been in development for some time, but it's only recently that the gap in the market has filled in a bit with the release of 2019's World War Z. The ongoing success of that title demonstrated that a demand for this sort of game still existed, and who better to deliver a new iteration on the formula than Turtle Rock Studios, the original creators of Left 4 Dead. To be clear, this video won't be a direct comparison between Back 4 Blood and Left 4 Dead, but it's nearly impossible to divorce the two titles. Their core DNA is the same, but the time period each game released in is reflected in their approaches. Left 4 Dead 2 didn't need the progression systems that have become so prominent in the years since its release. Instead, the title demonstrated confidence in its ability to keep people playing based solely on the satisfying gameplay, the endearing characters, the lore of the world, and the sheer fun of teaming up with your pals to survive a zombie apocalypse. To put it simply, the gameplay's fun factor alone was gratifying enough to keep people playing. I know, a pretty novel concept, right? But Back 4 Blood released in 2021, not 2009, and so it really isn't afforded the same luxuries. It seems like games can no longer just be fun. They must be living entities that keep you hooked with progression systems, limited time events, and more. This is the era that Back 4 Blood finds itself in, and it hasn't been able to escape that siren call. Still, even titles that include these systems can be enjoyable, and the Left 4 Dead formula has more than proven itself over the years. It's why Back 4 Blood was so anticipated by so many folks. The return of this enjoyable and entertaining gameplay loop with a new approach for the genre. It seemed like a home run, and in many ways, it absolutely is. The loop of darting between safe houses with your buddies while overcoming all manners of horrific zombie monstrosities is as satisfying as ever. And returning to a centralized base to secure upgrades for the next run has proven itself to be a decent inclusion. It's not nearly as antagonizing as monetized systems in other games, and it shakes up the gameplay enough to justify the inclusion. However, a thorough inspection reveals that Back 4 Blood has some core issues that drag down the experience. It would be quite easy to call this title inferior to Left 4 Dead and be done with it, but this game isn't inherently bad simply because it isn't as good as something that came before it. The issues plaguing Back 4 Blood are not ones of inferiority, but instead are flaws inherent to the approaches that the development team decided on for this game. Hopefully, these issues will be laid out for all to bear over the course of this lengthy analysis. And as a final note before we get started, this critique pertains mostly to the game's launch window and the month or two following it. It's a live service game, so things could change and improve. We're going to be taking a look at every aspect of this title, so buckle up. With that, welcome to my critique of Back 4 Blood. There's a lot to discuss, but where better to start than an overview of the gameplay and the rhythm of movement and combat within Back 4 Blood. There's many elements of this title to break down, but most critical to the experience is the feel of navigating levels and shooting zombies with an assortment of armaments. That's the heart and soul of the experience, and I'm happy to report things are pretty good here. We'll talk more about character builds and loadouts later on, but once you are in the levels, everything feels immediately familiar in the best way. It all starts in the safe room, where you'll get familiar with your weaponry and additional tools. Each character has 2 default starting weapons, but more can be purchased in the safe house. Each run will also start you with some copper, which is an in-game currency that allows you to buy items, upgrades, health, ammo, and weapons. You earn copper by completing levels, finding it in the world, or completing specific challenges. Each safe house contains a chest where you can spend your copper, which is super useful. Depending on the demands of the current run, you may elect to buy additional ammo and pipe bombs, but you might also plunk down a heavy portion of your copper to upgrade your team's overall health, to unlock additional slots to carry items, or improve the effectiveness of those items. The shop's items are also randomized each time, which helps promote the idea of every run being a little bit different from the last. But once you're equipped up in the safe house, you'll head out into the level. Once on Ridden Turf, your goal is to survive and make it to the next safe house by overcoming the obstacles in front of you, whether they be Ridden related or not. Combat is the core experience in this subgenre, and Back 4 Blood really needed to nail this aspect for the game to see continued success. Unfortunately, while things are relatively good, there's better options in the market, which concerns me for this game's future. Game feel is an incredibly daunting task to try to explain in a video. It's something each player will have to experience themselves to form an opinion. To me though, Back 4 Blood feels pretty good to play most of the time, but it's dragged down by certain elements, like a stamina bar and trauma damage. These exhaustive inclusions are a big reason why Left 4 Dead 2 saw a spike in player count following the release of Back 4 Blood. Why put up with the new limitations when something else better already exists? Still, Back 4 Blood does have some merit, so let's start with the good. There's quite a bit of variety in terms of the available weapons. There's a multitude of shotguns, pistols, automatic rifles, submachine guns, melee weapons, scout rifles, and snipers to choose from. Most of these weapons serve as primary weapons, but each character also carries a secondary weapon, which could be a melee item, pistol, or submachine gun. I'm happy to report that each of these packs a punch and allows for some diversity across the team. They feel great to shoot and have a real impact on the Ridden when they're upgraded. However, not all weapons are created equal at higher difficulties. Scout rifles and snipers proved far less useful with how often your team gets overrun. The fast pace of the gameplay and low magazine capacity and firing speed on these weapons made them borderline useless on harder modes, at least to me. Shotguns and automatic weapons reign supreme as they jive well into this frantic and fast gameplay style. In the secondary slot, melee weapons seem to be the go-to choice over pistols. These axes, hatchets, machetes, and bats provide a great source of close quarters crowd control so long as you can maintain your stamina as you eliminate Ridden. That's right, as I alluded to before, this game introduces a stamina bar to the Left 4 Dead formula, and it's not really a great inclusion. It seems like they added it just so that they could improve the size of the card pool with cards that improve it. Continued movement is vital in Back 4 Blood, especially on higher difficulties, and running out of juice is deflating. It takes away from the power fantasy and therefore the fun factor. Many systems like this have been added in Back 4 Blood, which is what allows the card system to flourish, but it comes at the cost of pure player fun. Okay, that was a bit of a tangent, but melee weapons are a great addition to your arsenal, especially if you build a deck around it. My only concern here is the limited options available, as it just seems like people would find other things to beat zombies with in an apocalypse of this magnitude. On top of that, two of the weapons, the hatchet and the axe, are overhead swings, which severely limits their range despite their typically higher damage output and swing speed. Still, they're a great way to free yourself if you get overrun with Ridden. So combat itself is relatively solid. There isn't a whole lot to explain there. The guns are fun to shoot, and melee weapons are enjoyable to swing. The limited number of supplies reinforces the necessity for resource management, which is critical. The bases are all covered in this regard. The most basic elements of combat in this game are relatively good. However, I want to now transition into what I consider to be the first of the game's core flaws. Throughout this video, I'll make note of 5 core issues that plague Back 4 Blood, much more so than other complaints and criticisms I offer. The first one is regarding how damage is dealt in this game. When Ridden make their way to you, they're going to chip away at your health. Duh. If it hits 0, you get incapacitated, and if you aren't saved in time, you die, and you await a respawn later in the level or in the next safe house. It's fairly simple stuff. However, Back 4 Blood feels the need to change things up by introducing a new mechanic called trauma. Every time you take a hit, your avatar will absorb trauma points. This results in your maximum health being lessened every single time you accrue enough trauma points. You may start a match with 145 base health, but it can be whittled down quickly if you absorb a lot of damage. It's not too bad on the base difficulty and easier levels, but upon reaching harder campaigns with more Ridden variants and specials, it becomes torturous. I've had runs where my health gets as low as 50 max HP, which means you die in a hurry. Even if you get a chance to heal, you're only going up to 50 health. It's brutal. The only way to restore lost health from trauma is by using wall-mounted medical stations, or with certain card perks, or in the safe houses of some levels. This infringes on the power fantasy greatly, as medical stations aren't guaranteed, and you can only be knocked down a certain number of times before you die. It almost forces your hand to carry extra toolkits to unlock rooms that contain medical stations. Trauma significantly detracts from the enjoyment of the game, and it feels like an unnecessary level of challenge that the game didn't really need. It feels artificial and cheap to take health away from the player so drastically without offering up ample opportunities to replenish it. I'm not sure who thought this was a good idea, but it wasn't. If you don't have a dedicated healer in your party with the right cards, you're screwed. Simple as that. However, when things are firing on all cylinders and your team is coordinated, the ammo is plentiful, the trauma is low, and you're succeeding, this game is super fun to play. It's really easy to slide back into that old groove and feel right at home as you progress through the campaign. The core gameplay loop is so solid, even if this isn't the perfected iteration of it that we may have hoped for. Of course, the feel of the gameplay is only half the battle, as this gaming subgenre is also defined by its level design, the atmosphere it creates, and the challenges and obstacles it provides. Back 4 Blood divides up its campaigns and narrative into 4 acts. Each act contains a handful of campaigns that usually contain between 2 to 5 missions, with an exception being made for the final campaign that is a bona fide final boss fight. In all, there's 10 campaigns to venture through, but each of them is meant to provide a different sort of experience. You have your long standard campaigns that you'd expect after playing other games in the genre, but there's also other shorter chapters that emphasize a particular objective or offer an alternative focus on the gameplay. Now, this might sound a little vague, but it will make sense as we break down each campaign in the game. The Devil's Return is your standard campaign for this style of game. It's exactly what you'd expect after coming over from Left 4 Dead or World War Z, and this was a smart move. Instead of introducing the game's fresh ideas into the main gameplay immediately, they opt to provide a traditional experience to start. There's 4 levels to traverse, and none of them overstay their welcome or introduce crazy twists to the gameplay. Instead, this chapter represents a thoughtful way of easing players into the experience, whether they be veterans of the genre or complete newbies. The first level starts you off within an enclosed environment so that you can get a feel for the controls before enemies can swarm from large open areas. It introduces core pillars of the gameplay, such as basic shooting, events that will call the horde, how safe rooms work, along with restocking supplies, and more. From here, each level builds on this opening by showing the player just a little bit more. This includes the game's first boss entity in the Ogre, a healthy dose of the special Ridden types, and more time to see how the card system will function. It all culminates in a finale mission, where you and your teammates must push through the horde, recover bombs, and blow up a ship that's allowing Ridden to access your home base. From these levels, the player can grasp the fundamental layout of the level design as well as the basic rhythms of gameplay. Travel from safe house to safe house using smart team play to overcome the vast number of infected, and round out the experience with a special event that challenges your skills. It's nothing revolutionary, it's just a solid campaign that leans on the foundation that was established by pioneers of the subgenre. And that's a damn good way of getting players to connect with your game from the outset. From here, we transition into Search and Rescue, a 3-level campaign that opens things up a little bit more. The main focus here is introducing more alternative objectives to strengthen the narrative's backbone and expand the gameplay. Back 4 Blood's story differs from Left 4 Dead's in the sense that the apocalypse has been ongoing for a while here, and much of the initial panic and chaos of trying to survive the initial outbreak has gone to the wayside. Instead, we have communities and resistance groups that actively fight back against the Ridden. It's about going on the offensive more than strict survival here in Back 4 Blood. Therefore, many missions will contain objectives geared towards reclaiming what the Ridden have taken. We see that here in Search and Rescue, where different objectives are introduced, such as saving survivors who are trapped. Taking back the world will require as many humans as possible, and preserving as many of them as we can is vital, and that's reflected in this campaign. The lore of the world and our role in it is expanded on in subtle ways through this approach, while also offering new gameplay ideas. It's not just about reaching the end of the level, it's about helping others. In fact, at multiple points in this campaign, you'll walk right past safe room doors to track down survivors, which really signals this change in approach. It's subtle, but I loved it. But what isn't subtle is the chapter's ending, where you hold out against an unyielding wave of relentless Ridden as the sounds of heavy metal fill up an abandoned bar. Nothing signals the tonal shift away from survivor to thriver more than eviscerating every single Ridden within the sector while being amped up by the in-your-face style of rock and roll music. The Dark Before the Dawn plays out kind of like a game of Capture the Flag. This 2-part chapter sees you recovering samples in the first half before transporting those samples to a safe zone where you wait for extraction. If you're playing solo, only 1 sample crate will spawn, but if you're playing with a squad, 2 will spawn. The catch here is that players who are carrying the crates can't go on the offensive against zombies. Your ability to shoot and melee is stripped away, meaning that you'll have to rely on your teammates to keep you safe as you move towards the designated safe areas. Upon reaching the final destination, you and your team will have to hold out for 5 minutes against an unrelenting wave of Ridden. Just like the previous chapter, this stand-your-ground approach to the finale further cements the empowered mindset these characters have. This chapter overall is not too bad on the easiest difficulty, which can still be quite challenging, don't get me wrong, but it does encourage a lot of team play and communication. It provides another objective type instead of simply moving through the levels, which makes it a worthwhile inclusion to me. These shorter chapters may originally present like a disappointment, but when you buy in on the team-based challenges and alternate style of play that they're trying to provide, you come to appreciate them more. After dipping into some different styles, Blue Dog Hollow reins things back in to deliver another excellent standard campaign. Each of the chapter's 4 levels introduces a new element that helps keep things fresh. The first level contains a new feature called nests. These oozing pus balls are the home of the Ridden, and destroying them allows you to proceed, but also signals the horde. A first encounter with this system can be a bit tricky, but after you get past it once, you'll understand it for the duration of your playtime. Essentially, there's one core nest that can only be destroyed after eradicating the tendrils that are attached to it. You'll have to follow these infected vein-like tubes to find nest nodes. Blowing those up calls the horde, but also gets you one step closer to finishing the level. After blowing up all the nodes, the final nest will reveal its weak spot, allowing you to kill it and progress. This system is used a handful of times throughout the game, and the nice part is that the location of nest nodes varies from playthrough to playthrough, meaning you can't cheese things through experience alone. It's a welcome inclusion to the genre. Meanwhile, the second level of Blue Dog Hollow introduces us to a fearsome creature called the Hag, but more on her later. The third level has an endless runner section where the player must sprint to the safe house as the horde continues to bombard their location. You can cut off some of the Ridden's tunnels to curtail a few of them, but there's going to be a lot of them either way. It's different, but it's welcomed. And finally, the last level sees you blowing up the main tunnel where the Ridden are hiding. To do this, you'll load and fire a howitzer a handful of times before being whisked away to safety. Generally, having one person to load the cannon while the other three protect them is the best approach. This gameplay structure almost forces the squad to take on roles, which is fantastic for a co-op game such as this. Blue Dog Hollow is a wonderful inclusion that ramps up the difficulty when compared to The Devil's Return, while also introducing some new elements into the gameplay. The Armory is perhaps the game's most lackluster chapter, as it only spans the course of 2 levels and doesn't introduce any real new elements for the player to tackle. Its first level is a standard reach the safe zone mission that we've seen many times already. This would be fine in a longer chapter, but in a short one, it feels like wasted potential. While we are here though, I wanted to highlight how often this game reuses the opening area outside of Fort Hope. It's not hard to appreciate how the game attempts to empower the humans of this world by giving them a defensible home base. They've established a secure location for themselves, which is great for the narrative approach they're going for. However, strictly from a level design perspective, it means this opening area will be reused a ton as you begin certain chapters. It's a relatively small area, but it gets repetitive quickly. It also feels very contrived that each chapter will take you in a different direction, and so all the other exits to this area are conveniently blocked off. The world feels restricted and artificial because of it, and the recycling of the same area doesn't help. The only positive that comes out of this is returning to areas you went through before, such as the library, so that you can see how things have changed since you secured it. This is a one-off instance though. Fort Hope should have had multiple exits, which would have provided more areas to venture through. Anyway, the second half of the mission is about destroying 3 nests and locating the remains of a fallen cleaner. To access the armory, the gang needs Bob's handprint to scan into the room. Unfortunately for Bob, he's been hunted and disemboweled by the Ridden, but destroying their nest reveals his remains. The last nest will always spawn Bob's arm, which hysterically acts as a melee weapon. To complete the chapter, the player must scan into the armory, only to discover it's been ransacked and overridden with infected. Plan B is the first chapter in the game that contains 5 different maps to venture through, much like the original campaigns of Left 4 Dead and its sequel. It gets kicked off with my personal favorite mission in the game, Pipe Cleaners. This musty underground pipe system has become a home to the water-loving parasites that mutate humans into the Ridden. The red emergency lights project a sense of tension and dread, and the walls are caked with alien flora that warps this average drainage system into something horrific. And it's all very condensed and maze-like, which leads to feelings of claustrophobia as you desperately try to reach the level's conclusion. You may be wondering why I'm going into such great detail to describe the ambience of this one level, and the answer to that is that this is the best atmosphere Back 4 Blood is able to generate. Many of the game's levels will see you traversing abandoned towns and forests with very little to differentiate one campaign from another stylistically. There's a distinct sense of sameness to the visuals amongst these chapters, meaning that not many levels are able to stand out as vividly as this. The game needed more of these sorts of cheek-clenching atmospheres to really make each chapter feel different from one another stylistically as much as they do mechanically. And to emphasize this point, following this brilliant opening, Plan B offers a town, a trailer park, and a clogged waterway full of crates. These levels are fine, but they pale in comparison to the opener. The only one of note is the clogged waterway, but its layout makes it hard to navigate and easy to fall off ledges that you didn't know were there. If Plan B could have sustained the momentum granted from its opening level, it would have been the best campaign in the entire game. Just when you thought things were settling in, Job 1022 throws a massive curveball your way to really shake things up. This chapter's defining feature is its pseudo-boss rush mode. There's only 3 levels to progress through, and they are all relatively short, but the challenge comes in the staunch wall of Ridden you're expected to penetrate. You of course have your standard Ridden to contend with, but there's also souped up special Ridden that have modifiers like armor or hordes of them. On top of that, each chapter will also contain at least one boss enemy. In the first mission, an ogre will spawn, in the second, an ogre and a breaker will be there to contend with, and in the final area, 2 breakers will pay you a visit. These ultra powerful Ridden can wreck your day in a hurry, and so an extra emphasis needs to be placed on your approach method. Will you choose to fight back, or make a run for the safe house? It's up to you to coordinate your team. If you choose to engage, and let's be honest you're going to, you're gonna have to talk strategy and where to focus your fire to eliminate some of these tougher enemies, which is great. It's another varying approach to this gameplay format that opens things up for a different experience. If you've always wanted a boss rush in these games, well, this is probably as close as you're gonna get. While I'm mostly positive on this chapter's inclusion, I do think it illustrates one of the game's biggest problems with boss design. There's 3 primary bosses, the Hag, the Ogre, and the Breaker. We'll talk about each later, but from a level design perspective, it's troublesome how predictable their appearances are. The game has predisposed areas where hags and ogres will always spawn, which really robs them of half the fun. Every run feeling different was a huge part of this game's marketing, but having your game's biggest hurdles be so predictable really runs counterintuitive to that principle. Players will always be able to prepare for these predetermined fights, which takes away from the excitement and surprise of it. Breakers aren't much better, as they won't always spawn, but they can still only show up in a few distinct areas. These bosses don't bring a lot of panic to the player because of their predictability, and the game is a little bit lesser because of it. Pound for pound, Dr. Rogers' Neighborhood is the best campaign in the game. The alternate modes of play are appreciated, but ultimately, this genre's bread and butter is these lengthy campaigns, and this one delivers on that more than any other in Back 4 Blood. Of all the campaigns in the game, this one provides the most number of consistently challenging but fair levels that will test your resource management, exploration skills, gunplay, and teamwork. It takes some of the new ideas like nests and alternate common infected and pairs it up with elements of level design that will challenge your resolve, such as moving through a cornfield full of birds, locating a battery to open up a gate, and a literal hedge maze. Each level is fine-tuned and balanced for the optimal amount of difficulty. You'll feel in control, but each distraction that I just mentioned can unravel your playthrough quickly if you don't solve them efficiently enough. Intelligent teamwork is just as vital as your ability to shoot in this campaign, and it leads to a lot of great encounters that feel fair. It all comes to an endpoint when you reach Dr. Rogers' mansion. This is an important turning point in the story, as we will come to see, which adds extra value, but it also provides a memorable and tense finale. Not since the very first chapter of the game has a finale provided us with a frantic feeling. Many of them have been about going on the offensive, which is fine, but it's undeniable how much tension is provided in a situation where you must defend a location while salvaging versus an empowered situation where you just blow the crap out of Ridden. This tension is felt throughout this finale, where you must recover and load up Roger's research as an unbelievably large horde of Ridden rain down on your position. Moving throughout the mansion like a madman as you search for those last few crates, only to make it out by the skin of your teeth, is exhilarating. It represents the best pure adrenaline rush this genre of games can provide to the player. Finale missions should act as a set piece, like the cherry on top for each campaign, and this one fulfills that role much more than any other, and it's for that reason that Dr. Rogers' Neighborhood is the best chapter in Back 4 Blood. If the previous chapter provided the pinnacle of this title's gameplay experience, The Remnants takes it a step too far. This is by far the most challenging chapter in the game, as each mission seems hell-bent on making your team perish. Each of the levels has something tough to throw at you, on top of being longer than most others. In the first level, you'll have to locate an ID card to progress through a funeral home that's full of Inferno Ridden. Annoyingly, the ID card can be super hard to locate and will see you searching the same rooms repeatedly to try to find it. I don't know why this is, but I always struggle to find this card in every single run. It's like the game doesn't spawn it in until I've killed enough Ridden. The second level takes place in a school that's full of nests, generators in need of power, tons of Ridden, and of course, an ogre. The third mission sees the team reaching the overrun CDC checkpoints. To reach the safe house, you'll have to navigate a maze-like assortment of tents while collecting important samples, all before making a mad run through a wave of incoming infected. You'll be running headfirst into a swarm of Ridden, and it's as tough as keeping your footing as a wave crashes down on you in the ocean. But by far, the chapter's final mission is the game's most challenging. You'll be gifted a new grenade type that does make things easier, but it's not enough to make things a cakewalk. You're tasked with destroying 3 nests scattered around a field of dead bodies while a non-stop horde crashes down on your location. All sorts of Ridden converge on you, and this includes a healthy dose of special variants and tons of ogres. It's very simple to get overwhelmed in a hurry and lose a whole run because of it. To me, the whole campaign is perhaps a little too much, but for those who like difficulty, The Remnants will surely provide you with what you seek. And finally, to round out Back 4 Blood's campaigns, we have the Abomination chapter, which serves as one last twist on the formula. Instead of offering multiple levels to trek through, our objective here is to defeat a final boss in what feels like a miniature raid. The Abomination threatens to destroy everything the cleaners have built, and it's up to our squad to defeat it. This mission is broken up into 3 parts, with each having the same objective: connect on the behemoth's weak spots to cripple it, and ultimately vanquish it. First, the team will have to shoot out 4 tentacles in this confined stretch of street work. You'll have to bait out an opening and focus fire to kill each one. Every time a tentacle goes down, the horde will spawn, and the fallen tentacle will begin spewing acid for a short time. After each tentacle is decimated, the team will jump down the shaft and come face to face with the creature. Here, it'll spam hordes, special Ridden, tentacle barrages, and acid to try to stop you from shooting the weak spots on the inside of its mouth. Choosing a tactical location and focusing your fire is a necessity to get past this part. Once it's defeated, the creature will attempt to escape. You have 5 minutes to follow it and shoot out its weak spots, which are located all along its body. It's very easy to get crushed here though, so once again, your ability to navigate is critical. It's also important for team members to shoot at the beast from different angles to maximize on damage as quickly as possible. Hopefully, this description of the chapter shows you just how much strategy is involved. It's not a raid like you might experience in Destiny, but it's the closest thing the game offers, and I did appreciate the alternate twist. One thing needs to be made clear though, and that's the fact that this mission is nearly impossible to complete with bots. Well, maybe not impossible, but a lot more tedious. the co-op AI simply isn't competent enough to deal with some of the alternate objectives sprinkled throughout the game, and nowhere is this more apparent than here in the final boss fight. The computers will not shoot at the abomination weak spots, making it so you must deal all the damage yourself. It can really drag out the experience and make this chapter a nightmare for anyone playing solo. The AI and the bot companions need some serious work to make playing solo more viable. Regardless, this concept of a raid should be expanded on further in future updates, as there's real potential for something amazing there if the team is able to build on the foundation they've established. A more complex version of this encounter would incentivize high-end team play across a lengthy challenge, which could only strengthen the game's community. Offering up more rewards for completing it would see players running it weekly or maybe daily to secure the points. It seems like a slam dunk idea to me, and I hope Turtle Rock goes into this direction as they continue to support Back 4 Blood. So to wrap this section up, let me recap. Back 4 Blood provides incredible variety in its approach to the gameplay. Not only do you have the lengthy campaigns you'd expect from a game in this genre, but you also have alternative modes like Capture the Flag, helping survivors and rebuilding, a boss rush, and a miniature raid. This approach allows for different kinds of experiences to be had, and you and the squad can change things up depending on what you're in the mood for. Turtle Rock Studios must be given credit for the fresh ideas introduced into the genre here in Back 4 Blood. I was skeptical at first, but the variety and level design won me over in the end and is by far one of the title's greatest strengths. If you're going to make a zombie game, it's important to make sure you take care in creating the infected. We've seen so many variants on the undead in video games, but they aren't all created equal. Every game within this genre needs a specific type of zombie that reflects and forms the intended gameplay experience. This is perhaps most important in the subgenre that Back 4 Blood belongs to, considering killing undead is the primary thing you do. When playing a game like this, the zombies need to be intimidating enough to threaten the player mechanically, while also instilling at least some fear into them with their design. They also need to have numbers on their side to promote a feeling of overcoming the odds. After all, this game is meant to act as a power fantasy, even more so than in Left 4 Dead, as we will come to see when we get to the story section. And finally, enough enemy variety needs to be included to ensure the experience doesn't get stale. With that established, let's take a look at how Back 4 Blood holds up on these fronts. Every game nowadays has to come up with its own unique name for zombies, and they're called Ridden here. There's three groupings that all Ridden fit into. There's common ones that act as generic zombies, there's special Ridden that have unique abilities, and there's boss Ridden that prove to be a massive threat. Starting with the most basic of the Ridden, and they're functionally just fine. Across all media, these sorts of zombies are defined by their easiness to kill, but the threat they create in numbers. That's once again true in Back 4 Blood. The common Ridden spawn in healthy doses and provide fodder for your bullets to mow down. They can't threaten you too much on their own, and will often go down after a bullet or two is lodged into their head or torso. However, when the Horde is summoned, they are capable of chipping away at your health bar. They can flank you from all sides, and if you aren't fast enough to get them off, it's easy to be overwhelmed and lose a large chunk of your overall health. There's also a few variations on this basic enemy, such as ones that can sprint, ones that are engulfed in flames, others that explode, and some that leave behind acid puddles. It's the standard for what you'd expect, and not much more, which is okay. Again, these are meant to be the most basic enemy, and they serve that purpose well. You mow them down, and you move on. However, that's speaking on them from strictly a mechanical perspective. They also need to be intimidating to the player in intrinsic ways. We feel their presence externally through the chipping away at our health bar, but they don't provide the same frights as other zombies in the genre. This is more so a commentary on the art direction, and that will always be subjective, but these zombies simply don't look as intimidating or unsettling as the ones found in other games of the subgenre. This comes down to two factors: the facial designs and the animations. In Left 4 Dead, the zombies' hellbent desire to eat your face was seen clearly in their ravenous animations. Here, the Ridden are much more docile. When they do pursue you, it's not the blood-crazed sprint of a predator stalking prey. It's more of a slow walk or jog in your direction. Therefore, it doesn't activate our fight or flight response nearly as often and becomes another factor for why the game feel isn't as good as it could be. Another consequence of this is that the Ridden don't often get close enough to you for their facial features to become apparent. You don't see that demented look in their eyes enough to be intimidated, and when they do get close, they don't have enough detail to convey the threat that they're meant to. So what we're left with is a zombie that functions mechanically and it's fine, but it doesn't elicit much fear or uneasiness in the player. Moving on, we have our Special Infected or Special Ridden. These souped up infected have harder hitting moves and unique abilities that are meant to increase the challenge, either by summoning the horde, dealing heavy damage, or trapping you where you stand. A handful of them have weak spots that can be targeted to deal more damage, but aiming, while responsive, is not fine-tuned enough on console to consistently hit these targets, which is frustrating. For example, some Ridden, such as the Tall Boy, hide their weak spot while moving, making it even more difficult to connect on shots. That's a brief overview of Special Ridden, but now let's take a look at them categorically. There's 5 different breeds of Special Ridden, if you will. There's Tall Boys, Stingers, Reekers, Snitches, and Sleepers. Starting with Snitches and Sleepers, these are 2 of the game's best Ridden, and the ones I have nothing but praise for. Snitches will slowly pursue you, but won't do much of anything unless you come in very close contact or outright shoot them. Doing so alerts the horde. They intermingle with common Ridden, meaning it's important to mark their location and avoid making contact because it's very easy to confuse them for normal infected. It introduces a small element of tactical gameplay, which is always good. And if the Snitches are about monitoring the common Ridden for outliers, then Sleepers are about monitoring your surroundings for them. These dormant creatures nest on vertical surfaces all throughout the game, whether they be on the sides of buildings or large trucks. They won't do much until you get close. From there, they leap out and incapacitate you until a teammate bashes them off of you. If you see them ahead of time, you can shoot them while they sleep, but failing to identify them will punish stragglers, which encourages the importance of playing as a team. These 2 Special Ridden encourage mindfulness, which means higher engagement for the player. The remaining 3 categories of Special Ridden each have 3 variants within them. The Tall Boy family has Tall Boys, Bruisers, and Crushers. The Stinger family has Hawkers, Stingers, and Stalkers, and the Reeker family has Reekers, Exploders, and Wretches. Fundamentally, each family is identified by a core feature, such as the Tall Boy's powerful melee attacks, the Reeker's acid-based blasts, and the Stinger's ability to slow you down. In other words, you have 3 distinct ways of threatening the player, with immediate heavy damage, with ranged attacks that chip away at health, and stunning powers to keep the player trapped momentarily. It's good stuff. Within those families, you have the variations I mentioned that alter how the core ability works. For example, Tall Boys will hit you with an overhead attack, a Crusher will immobilize you and deal damage, and a Bruiser can spam hard-hitting punches rapidly. To me, this is where the first of the 2 major issues surrounding Special Ridden comes from. I appreciate the attempt at differentiating within each family of Special Ridden, but not enough was done to make them feel unique. When in the heat of the moment, it's nearly impossible to identify a Reeker from a Wretch or a Tall Boy from a Bruiser. Mechanically, this isn't an issue since they're all defeated with bullets like any other enemy, but presentationally, they rob those special variants from having a personality all their own. In the Left 4 Dead series, it was easy to call out what you were seeing. Smokers were much different than spitters, who were much different from jockeys, who were much different from chargers, and so on and so forth. Here, that isn't the case. It results in these groupings that are hard to differentiate, making enemy variety a little less praiseworthy in Back 4 Blood. Of course, this issue is small potatoes compared to the other involving Special Ridden. In fact, this next issue is so detrimental to the game that I'm labeling it as my second core issue with Back 4 Blood. Despite having some good ideas for Special Ridden, the game is entirely too eager to spam these enemies ad nauseum. There are countless times when cleaners will be ganged up on by Special Ridden, such as spawning 3 exploders, 2 tall boys, and a couple of stingers, all within minutes of one another. In one playthrough, which I unfortunately wasn't recording, I witnessed 7 tall boy variants within 3 minutes during the Remnants chapter. These overwhelming odds can quickly screw up a run that was going well, which never feels good. Left 4 Dead was praised for its director AI system, which dynamically chose when to make the game easier and harder based on how the players were faring. If things were going well, maybe restrict health spawns and summon some special infected. But if the gang was struggling, the game may elect to cut back on the tank it was about to spawn, or throw you a few medkits to heal up. It was really well balanced, and that isn't the case in Back 4 Blood, and it's a huge blow against the game. Nothing is more frustrating than feeling like the game is cheating when it spawns in horde after horde of common zombies while also allowing a few hawkers to immobilize half your team while 2 tall boys crush you to death. Sometimes they all come at once, but other times they come one after another with no break to heal up. It happens frequently and randomly, and it just feels unfair. It saps all fun from the game and needs major tweaking to re-establish the balance needed to provide an enjoyable and challenging experience. Turtle Rock has been receptive towards these concerns and are actively looking to fix the high spawn rates and difficulty overall, which is the benefit of a live service game. Hopefully they do it ASAP, because I'm tired of getting crushed to death every 3 seconds. And finally, we come to the boss variants, of which there are 3: ogres, hags, and breakers. These enemies are gifted a full-on health bar outside of the hag, which detracts from the game. There's a real sense of fear that stems from being up against formidable foes, but when the player can see their health depleting in real time, it can take away from that primal adrenaline burst that comes from fights of this nature. The fight becomes less about the enemy's design and its abilities, and more about watching the health bar as you pepper it with bullets. There's something rewarding about taking down a foe after an intense fight in which you had no clue how close the beast was to death. This was evident in battles against tanks in Left 4 Dead 2, and that element has been lost here in this gamification of the system. Let's keep it right there on the hags for a moment though, because while I just praised them, they are the boss ridden that gives the most fits. Hags can swallow a player whole, run away, and dig underground, which instantly kills the kidnapped cleaner. They have a weak spot on their backs, but in my experience, unloading full rounds on this creature rarely stops it in its tracks. I've been in matches where the team fully unloads on a hag, and yet it still manages to kill someone off. They are super threatening, but their HP pool is just a little too high. Of course, there have been other times where we warded off much easier, simply by having someone lure it in and then running away while everyone else shoots it. The hag is a wonderful inclusion who is super intimidating. Breakers are meant to be this game's version of the tank in Left 4 Dead. However, they are much slower, making them much less of a threat. They lumber around the levels and attack the player through lunges that leave them stunned for a few seconds. This one-note boss isn't intimidating looking, nor is it fulfilling to fight mechanically, since all you must do is dodge and spray while it's stunned. Breakers are a severe letdown, especially since they don't spawn as frequently as you'd expect. Lastly, there's the ogres, and these are pretty one-dimensional as well. These behemoths tower over the cleaners and can deal massive damage with melee and ranged attacks. However, they're really easy to run past, which is often the correct choice, despite it being antithetical to the core principles of the game. It never feels good to run away from a zombie and leave it alive, but ogres eat up a lot of bullets and a lot of bombs if you choose to stay and fight. On top of that, their gargantuan size means they can only show up at a handful of locations across the game, so their appearance is easy to predict. And as I alluded to before, predictability in this subgenre is kind of a killer. So overall, the zombies of Back 4 Blood are passable, but could certainly use some tweaking. There's enough variety to keep the players on their toes, but there's far too many issues in their design. Common zombies aren't intimidating, the special Ridden appear too frequently, and none of them feel like fresh ideas for the genre, and the boss monsters are predictable and flawed in their own ways. Some of these issues can be addressed in patches and updates, but some of them are baked directly into the game's DNA, making it unlikely that they'll be resolved anytime soon. It's about time we discuss Back 4 Blood's biggest addition to the subgenre, and that would be its card system that heavily promotes build diversity. Make no mistake, Back 4 Blood is a numbers game much more so than any other entry in the subgenre. There are three elements to discuss here: the playable characters, the weapon upgrades, and most importantly, the card system. At the time of writing, there's 8 different playable characters: Mom, Doc, Walker, Jim, Hoffman, Holly, Carly, and Evangelo. Each of them has 3 benefits. One is a perk, one is a stat boost, and the other is a team stat boost. For example, Evangelo's perk would be that he can break free of a grab once per 60 seconds, he has a plus 25% stamina regen, and he grants the team 5% faster move speed. On the other hand, there's Walker, who gets plus 20% accuracy for 5 seconds after precision kills, plus 10% damage overall, and plus 10 health points for the entire team. Not to overindulge, but I do want to mention one more. Doc can heal each teammate for 25 health once per level. She has plus 20% healing efficiency and plus 25% trauma resistance for the entire team. Hopefully from these perks alone, you can start to see that each character supports a different playstyle. Evangelo is a great melee character, Walker is great with guns, and Doc is the best healer in the game. That's not to say that each character is locked into a certain playstyle, just that some cleaners are better at certain roles than others. These base stats provide a jumping off point of sorts, but the cards you select are what really come to define your capabilities. Before we get to that though, it's also important to note that the weapons you wield are just as critical as the character you choose to play as. Beyond choosing shotguns for shotgun builds, or to wield a machete in melee builds, we also must consider the rarity of each weapon. That's right, just like every other multiplayer game since Fortnite, we have a weapon rarity system, from common to uncommon to rare to legendary. Get ready to see a lot of gray, green, blue, and purple as you scan the environment for potential weaponry. On top of that, weapon modifications can be added to your guns to further customize and upgrade them. Now, this obviously means you should always grab a higher rarity version of the weapon that fits your build. Or so you would think. For some unfathomable reason, you can't detach weapon modifications from your weapons. You can replace them with other mods, but you can't drop them like you can with anything else in your inventory. This results in many instances where you find a higher rarity version of the gun you're using, but it comes equipped with lesser or no mods. I've turned away guns with more damage and accuracy simply because I like the modifications on my current guns, but that exchange never felt good. It seems like an obvious oversight that should have been cleaned up by now, but it hasn't at the time of writing this. So that's a little bit about 2 of the basic elements for character builds, the character you select and the guns you use. The real ability to create builds in this game though comes from something more complex, a card system. At release, there's about 150-ish cards in the game to collect and use to build various decks. Each deck contains 15 cards. When starting a match, depending on the level and difficulty selection, the player will be granted between 1 and 5 cards off the top of their deck. These are known as starter cards. From there, every time a safe house loads, the player will get to choose an additional card to apply to their current build. At the same time, the AI will gain corruption cards that twist the experience up by granting new modifiers to the Ridden, such as armor, extra specials, or fog to hide in. Before we even discuss the quality of the cards though, this is a great format to utilize. Because each card is presented to the player in the same order every time, the arrangement of the deck is critical. Once you get it just right, the consistency allows for less frustration than you might see if decks were shuffled and randomized each time. This creates an enjoyable cycle where you experiment with your deck, perfect it, and then rearrange it as you earn new cards. Rinse and repeat, and it's a lot of fun. Taking a deeper look at the cards themselves reveals a lot of variety. There's 4 categories of cards called Reflex, Discipline, Brawn, and Fortune, but these titles are ultimately pretty meaningless. Instead, it's easiest to think of the cards as being offensive, defensive, utility-based, or mobility-based. Most cards will offer up a simple stat boost, such as increased weapon reload speed, or faster movement, or more trauma resistance, while other cards take these perks further, but with a downside to consider. For example, Grenade Training gives you plus 25% accessory damage, while Demolitions Expert gives you plus 50% accessory damage, but it comes with a 15% reduction to ammo capacity. Sometimes it's best to just take the advantage, but some builds might not care about the ammo capacity, so the extra damage is worth the cost. It's a small example, but the card pool is littered with little choices like this to consider while constructing a build. It's really well done. On top of that, there's also more unique cards available that drastically change up your experience. For example, melee builds might consider using the card called Meth Head. I love that, by the way. But Meth Head gives you plus 40% melee attack speed, plus 30% melee stamina efficiency, and your melee attacks don't bounce off bigger enemies. Its downside is that your ability to aim down sights is disabled. On the other hand, gun builds might like the card called 2 is 1 and 1 is none, that allows you to equip a primary weapon in your secondary slot at the cost of weapon swap speed being reduced by 25%. Another card called Medical Professional allows players to heal teammates for 15 trauma damage and provide an additional life when using a defib or medkit on them. So hopefully you can see the variety between the cards. Some are simple and provide small buffs, while others provide multiple and direct changes to the gameplay with a cost. There's a lot of decisions to be made and experimentation to be had, and that's always a good thing. But once you construct a couple decks, it's time to squad up. And when squatting up, it's important to consider roles for your gang, especially on higher difficulties. A medic is always useful, as is a melee build that can tank damage, while others hang in the back to pick off straight Ridden. However, if you want to get funky, you can utilize 4 mobility decks and race each other to the next safe house as quickly as possible. The point I'm trying to make here is that there's a lot of diversity. Not all the cards are stellar, but enough selection is included to mess around with to find what works for you. There's the ability to build great decks, but there's also some weird ones to have some fun with. And because Back 4 Blood is such a numbers game, you can feel tangible changes to your experience based on the cards you choose to play. A sacrifice has been made to your starting prowess, as you aren't always capable of dealing with threats easily until you get more cards. Sometimes this sacrifice is too much and balanced improperly, as it can feel downright brutal when stamina is drained or damage is minimal. Once you do get your cards though, your proficiency starts to develop more and more. Everything from increased melee damage, to bullet damage, to copper found, to overall health, to trauma relief, and more plays a role in each run, and so having to choose what's best for the current run provides a lot of strategic thought. However, I do want to iterate this one problem again. Your starting capabilities are muffled to allow for this card system to breathe, and sometimes that gets very frustrating. Most of the time I enjoy it, but sometimes I feel a little too weak to start, and that just is frustrating. Now, overall, this may all be sounding quite good, and it is, but there's an issue that drags down this card system, so much so that I'm labeling it as my third core issue with Back 4 Blood. This issue has to do with how you earn points to spend on new cards and the bloat that comes along with it. Every time you complete a level, you'll be rewarded with a certain number of supply points, the in-game currency. The number you receive is determined by the difficulty you're playing on, the length of the map, and how many cleaners make it to the safe house alive. Returning to Fort Hope allows you to spend these supply points in what's called supply lines. These are essentially mini battle passes that can't be purchased with real-world money. They contain not only cards, but also customization items, such as outfits, weapon skins, emblems, sprays, and more. There's 3 supply lines available at a time, and when you're first starting, things are pretty good. Each supply line has a healthy balance of cosmetics and cards. However, as you purchase more cards, the amount of customization bloat becomes more apparent. There's only 150-ish cards in the base game, but there's hundreds of cosmetics to gather. This means later into your experience, you'll see more supply lines that don't contain cards. Instead, they'll be clogged with cosmetics. This is particularly frustrating when you need a specific card to take your build to the next level, such as when I needed the Ignore the Pain card for my melee build. For a while, I was desperately searching for this card, but was stuck with junk I'll never use. Some of the bloat is okay, such as weapon and character skins, but like many other games with this system, there's a lot of useless crap. Worthless items like emblems, sprays, and banners are included just to balloon the amount of items to keep you playing in search of cards you need. It's ridiculous. I hate when games do this. This leads me into my next point about how the replayability value of Back 4 Blood is tied to number crunching and bloated supply lines much more than good old-fashioned fun. Even though it's subjective, there's something to be said about wanting to play a game again because it's fun, versus doing so to get a chance to maybe unlock new modifiers for your build. The original Left 4 Dead and its sequel had faith that its core gameplay and AI director were enough to keep players coming back. And they were right. In Back 4 Blood, it's much easier to feel the game trying to entice you in with rewards, like a mother offering her kid candy in exchange for cleaning his room. To me, it demonstrates a lack of faith in the strength of the gameplay, as it instead relies on the progression grind that infects many a AAA game. Everything we've talked about so far is true of the game's lowest difficulty, which is still plenty challenging. Although that is changing, as Turtle Rock has admitted that the game at launch was far more difficult than they intended. Regardless, let's look at what the higher levels of difficulty bring to the experience. There's 2 advanced modes, Veteran and Nightmare. Veteran mode applies 35% friendly fire damage, but gives 75% more supply points. Nightmare, on the other hand, really takes things to the limit. In this mode, cleaners have 1 less life and take increased trauma damage. Meanwhile, Ridden have increased health, damage, and variety alongside of access to every corruption card in the game. Oh, and friendly fire is at 60%. Playing on this mode is crazy, but it does grant 150% increased supply points. Let's start by looking at Veteran mode because this is at least manageable. In these higher difficulties, it's much more important to construct great decks and be surrounded by good players who communicate readily. It's in this setting where the strength of your deck is felt much more, and every decision on which card to activate next is magnified. The game doesn't go bonkers with bullshit corruption card modifiers, but it does pump up the number of hordes, Ridden mutations, and overall damage. Therefore, having a team who knows their role is critical. Dedicated healers, melee tanks, and distinct gun builds can go a long way in creating a team capable of overcoming the challenge. It further encourages experimentation with different decks and to keep playing for new cards that might give you the edge you need. Veteran is plenty challenging and seems to be the best fit for hardcore fans of the title. Nightmare mode, on the other hand, is ridiculous, and only the craziest of players will attempt to finish this difficulty. Yeah, they're dedicated, but they're also a little crazy. Not only do you have further increases to enemy spawn rate, and more health and damage for Ridden, but you also get blasted with the full pool of corruption cards. This means having to deal with cards like Biohazard that will consistently drain your overall health, while granting a small portion of it back for every kill you achieve. Cards like this result in matches getting out of hand very quickly, and it also encourages players to speedrun as much as possible. To me, this runs counterintuitive to the title's main gameplay, as sprinting through levels shouldn't be the objective. Navigating to the safe house is of course critical, but it's about overcoming the challenges thrown at you during that expedition. In Nightmare, often the best strategy is simply to run and pray you're able to get to the safe room, which isn't very fun. Including cards that increase movement speed and stamina seems mandatory, as your best chance of survival is to keep moving indefinitely. Even then, it might not be enough. If you run into a breaker on this mode, forget it. You can't just run away from them given the harmful circle they spawn around themselves, so you'll have to take it head on. It outputs so much damage that it's nearly impossible to not get overrun. Outside of changing up the core experience drastically, there really isn't anything wrong with Nightmare mode, but I can't see many casual players enjoying it given its unrelenting difficulty. It's truly a challenge for the most dedicated of players, and while I really love the game, that doesn't mean me. It's in these more difficult settings that the true nature of the card system truly comes out. It's both a blessing and a curse. Accumulating new cards and building strong decks will help you overcome these challenges, but you'll first have to grind out the supply points to get them and hope the good ones show up in your supply line. On top of that, so many elements of the gameplay are heightened, such as your DPS, trauma damage, overall health, copper stash, and if you don't have the cards to overcome your weakened starting point, you're boned. The card system giveth, but the card system also taketh away. Between the two modes, Veteran is the better experience, as it strikes a balance between challenge and fun. If the issue with spamming special Ridden can be cleaned up, then this mode will become the de facto difficulty for many dedicated players. Nightmare, on the other hand, seems like a cruel joke, and it's nearly impossible to complete unless you dedicate your life to the game. There is, of course, another mode of play that I haven't touched on yet, and that would be the game's PvP. I hate to say it, but this isn't a case where I've saved the best for last, as Back 4 Blood's PvP is relatively bare bones and pretty pathetic. In the Left 4 Dead series, Versus mode saw two teams competing to finish campaigns as quickly as possible. The first run would see one team playing as the survivors and the other team playing as special infected. On the next run, the teams would switch places, with the best score winning. It seems to me though that Turtle Rock believed this mode was a bit flawed, because many matches would go on for quite a while, leading some players to check out early. That's just a speculation, but it might be the case given the drastic change in Back 4 Blood. Here, teams take turns trying to survive against the Horde for as long as possible within a small area. Instead of moving through entire levels, teams are confined to portions of levels within the main campaign. During a match, one team attempts to survive while the other spawns in as special infected and looks to kill off the team quickly. As the match progresses, the available safe area shrinks much like a circle in a battle royale. Once the cleaners have wiped, the teams switch places and play through the whole thing again. The team that lasts the longest wins the round, and the best 2 out of 3 rounds is declared the winner of the match. These matches can last anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes on average, as the shrinking circle ensures most rounds won't go past 5 minutes for each team. It's a fairly simple setup that in theory offers a better experience than Versus. You get the pleasure of controlling the special infected, which was a point of emphasis in Left 4 Dead, and matches don't last forever like they did before. However, this isn't paper. This is real life. Well, I mean it's a game world, but you know what I mean. The biggest problem with Back 4 Blood's PvP is that it's boring. It lacks the momentum and pleasure of meticulously moving through an entire campaign with your squad while also exploring out-of-bounds areas as the special infected as you spawn in and plan your next attack. The area is so confined that Ridden can only spawn into a handful of places, leading to less opportunity for an ambush. Things are much more rushed here, which ends up making the mode feel much sloppier. There isn't nearly as much strategy here. It's just spawn in and try to do damage before dying. There's way less opportunity for dynamic gameplay moments because of this confined space. Another factor that contributes to this mode's boredom is how often it has you waiting around, especially while playing as the Ridden mutations. Cleaners have 90 seconds to look through their deck and pick their next set of cards. Then they get additional time to scavenge the map to choose a hiding spot and grab weaponry to use. During this time, mutations must stand around with their thumb up their ass doing absolutely nothing. Sure, you can upgrade each mutation's stats, but this takes less than 10 seconds. A lot of time is spent then just waiting for the match to start, and once it does, you can die very quickly as a mutation. From there, you can't respawn for 15 to 20 seconds, which is boring, again. You'll spend just as much time waiting around as you will playing, which doesn't bode well for a game whose PvE typically jam-packs every second with bullets and chaos. And finally, if a player disconnects from your match, you're pretty much out of luck, as bots will not spawn in to take their place. You can very easily get into matches that are 4 versus 3, or 3 versus 2, or 4 versus 2, and you're just screwed if you're on the team with less players. Apparently, the game tries to balance this out by using a multiplier for the disadvantaged team, but in my experience, this didn't make a difference at all. I never saw it in action. So, overall, the PvP mode functions as intended, but those intentions don't maximize player enjoyment, as there's far too much time spent waiting around just to lose because someone decided to opt out early. There really isn't much of a reason to play PvP in Back 4 Blood. If they want to keep this mode, that's fine, but I'd heavily encourage the addition of more PvP modes, such as the traditional versus from Left 4 Dead. I'm not willing to call this mode a core issue, since it's relatively inoffensive, but improving it would go a long way in boosting this game's value and also the community's perception of it. Back 4 Blood surprisingly has more story content than you'd expect from a game within this subgenre. A light but tangible emphasis has been placed on the narrative, as there's a through line to follow throughout the campaign. As I mentioned earlier, this does detract from the game's level design and presentation, as many areas are reused while also looking very similar stylistically. The question then becomes, does the storytelling make up for what is lost? The answer? No. The events of Back 4 Blood transpire in Pennsylvania 1 year after an alien parasite was discovered in Canada and wreaked havoc on the Americas. This worm creature, nicknamed the Devil Worm, is a parasitic creature that infects hosts and turns them into the Ridden. Its sole purpose is to reproduce and ravage every human in its wake. It appears some humans have a natural immunity though, and many of the fortunate ones have started settlements where they defend themselves against the horde. This is where our game starts, and since it's been a year since the initial outbreak, enough time has passed for communities to form and go on the offensive against the Ridden. The panicked moments of escape found in the openings of Left 4 Dead and its sequel are replaced with tactical missions where teams attempt to recover supplies and eliminate Ridden from the area. This does at least provide a nice change of pace from other games within this subgenre. We join up with a squad of cleaners who are negotiating with another camp in Evansboro to share supplies. Negotiations aren't going well, but they quickly give way to chaos as the Ridden reappear for the first time in a while. Captain Phillips, the leader at Fort Hope, radios to his cleaners and implores them to get back quickly as they can't risk the Ridden reaching their base. The gang makes their way back before the bridge to Evansboro is blown up. Still, the Ridden find their way to the community surrounding Fort Hope, and the cleaners turn their attention to recapturing the town and cutting off the Ridden access point. They do this by blowing up the mines at Blue Dog Mine. This concludes Act 1. In Act 2, the cleaners work to capture a large supply of weapons to better defend Fort Hope. This act is the least involved one throughout the game and doesn't push the story forward all that much. This changes in Act 3 though when the cleaners are sent to recover a scientist named Dr. Rogers. Rogers was focused on finding a cure to the parasite, but changed his attention towards eradicating the Ridden after concluding that they couldn't be saved. He's developed a bomb called T5 that severely weakens the Ridden, allowing them to be killed much easier. This seems to be the breakthrough Fort Hope needs to protect their community. The bombs need further testing though, and so Phillips and Rogers send the cleaners to the source of the infection. It's a massive open grave that provided the perfect breeding ground for the parasite to spread, but the cleaners tear through everything using the T5. As they return to camp, a massive fight has broken out at Fort Hope. Ridden are hounding the area relentlessly, and just when things can't get any worse, a massive creature called the Abomination rips through the ground and all hope seems to be lost. The gang's helicopter crashes and Rogers is killed, but the group fights back and defeats the Abomination by collapsing the tunnels in on it. The story concludes with a few of the cleaners questioning what the hell they just fought before vowing to find the rest of them and eliminating them too. All in all, it's a super short story that exists solely to set up the gameplay. It's a little bit more involved than Left 4 Dead, but it's nowhere near a compelling story. Still, its ending insinuates that future content may see the cleaners traveling to other parts of the country in search of other abominations, which hopefully means we'll get some variation in the aesthetics of future campaigns. The story here is fine for what it is, and it accomplishes its task of providing a little context to the gameplay. The last thing to discuss in this story section is the characters, and it's the game's most disappointing element regarding the narrative. At launch, there's 8 different cleaners to play as. These include an ex-military officer named Walker, a nerdy adult geek named Hoffman, a punk rock chick named Carly, a doctor called Doc, a hipster named Evangelo, a motherly figure named Mom, a rambunctious young woman named Holly, and a dude called Jim. Some of these descriptions may seem a little condescending, but they really aren't meant to be. There isn't much to say about some of the characters, whether it be about their backgrounds or their personalities. We're not given a whole lot from them, and what we do get doesn't make any of them stand out. And it's a shame, they all feel pretty forgettable. One of the most endearing parts about Left 4 Dead was its assortment of 4 characters. By limiting the number of playables, the game ensured they'd always be together and could build distinct personalities for each to play off of one another. That same care and attention hasn't been given to the cleaners in Back 4 Blood. None of these characters can hold a candle to Ellis, Coach, Bill, Zoe, Lewis, or any of the other memorable cast members of that franchise, and it's not particularly close. The best we can muster here is the different interactions the characters can have with one another based on who you bring into the mission with you. For example, if you don't bring Hoffman on the Blue Dog Hollow campaign, characters will comment on how they're surprised he didn't tag along because he's always itching to get out in this direction. But if Hoffman does come, he will comment on his excitement to be there because it means he might be able to find his father. It's not much, but it's something, I guess. What happens most of the time though is that characters will repeat the same conversations over and over again. This happened in Left 4 Dead as well, but the conversations were context sensitive to whatever was happening within the campaign, such as Alice commenting on stealing Jimmy Gibbs Jr.'s car when it's right in front of them. Here though, that isn't the case quite as much. You'll hear the same conversations over and over, such as the one between Mom and Evangelo about the death of her son, or Holly spouting on about the guilt she feels for abandoning her family. These quips play at random times, and they seem to be totally divorced from the context of what's going on around the characters. They just say it because they need something to say, so they just go off. Now there is some context-sensitive dialogue, but it also isn't memorable or impactful.
I need the library secure, so use whatever you have to. At the moment, it's got more holes in it than Swiss cheese.
It's just a shame. So much so that I'm labeling the approach to narrative, world building, and story as the fourth core issue in this game. We're not given enough background information on the infection in the game, the characters aren't as impactful and memorable, and the story is really bare bones. If you're going to put effort into this category and take development time away from something else, then produce a story worth telling. I commend them for trying something new, but honestly, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Keep things really simple. Don't try a little bit and give us something like this. That brings us to the game's presentation and performance, and unfortunately, it's here where we must discuss the game's fifth and final major core issue. This video is already plenty long enough, so I won't waste your time going over the graphics. As you can see, the game isn't the greatest looking in the world, but it doesn't really need to be as long as the technical side holds up. I should also note that the music is really nothing special. Instead, I want to focus on the myriad of issues I encountered while playing to demonstrate the lack of polish. Let me go ahead and list out some of them for you. I've had the audio randomly cut a few times throughout the game, which makes things very eerie, but not in a good way. For some reason, the reload button and open doors button is the same, meaning I've opened so many safe room doors accidentally after partially emptying a clip trying to clear the exit point. On one run, the abomination enemy wouldn't open its mouth, meaning we couldn't kill it. We were just stuck there and had to quit. In the chapter where you airlift supplies, the cables glitch out and stretch out across the map. On top of that, I've seen some of my fellow cleaners just kind of slide around the battlefield. There's also been times where enemies clip through doors and walls. I've seen breakers do slow motion jumps that make it seem like they could jump across the entirety of the map. There has been a ton of little issues like this that detract from the title. Far too many bugs and glitches to call this a polished experience. However, there's other major issues with the technical side of the game as well. The AI of your companions and the number of reused assets and areas. The AI can be pretty brain dead at times, as there's the standard issues you'd expect from a game like this. This includes them not focusing fire properly, wasting bombs and molotovs, getting stuck in the environment, or taking forever to revive you after a fall. These aren't new complaints for the genre. However, the alternate gameplay objectives provide new hurdles that this AI seems to stumble on. All of the mini objectives, such as boarding up windows or destroying nests, are firmly out of their wheelhouse, meaning you'll have to do all the work yourself. At the same time, they are utterly useless in the final confrontation with the abomination. They won't shoot its weak spots, which leaves you to finish off the creature on your own. Most of the time, you simply don't have enough damage output to do this efficiently. It's these sorts of shortcomings in the artificial intelligence that really upset a lot of players when the game launched in terms of how they handled solo mode. Again, at launch, all of the rewards and supply points and trophies were locked away if you played solo. You had to progress by playing through the campaign. And as someone who played through a lot of Left 4 Dead 2 by himself, that was really disappointing. And it should also be noted that these issues with AI are particularly alarming given how fast the player count is dwindling. Everyone loves the bots when they spend all their resources on you, but far too often they don't comply with the objective here in Back 4 Blood. The other major issue I want to discuss is the game's reusing of so many areas. I've alluded to this throughout the video, but the amount of repurposed areas in this game is staggering. So many of the game's campaigns recycle previous destinations with not much more than a slight touch-up. You'll visit this area outside of Fort Hope no less than 3 times, this area with the motel is visited twice, this section directly outside of the church is visited 3 times. You get the point. And each time you revisit these areas, previously unlocked sections are gated off arbitrarily just to signal that this is a different campaign. Other assets like winding warehouses, cozy cabins, and large trucks are reused a handful of times throughout the campaign as well, which comes off as a bit lazy. Sure, it makes things appear more cohesive stylistically, but spotting reused models detracts from the experience by giving you deja vu in a bad way. Splashing in a bit of color might have helped clean up this problem, but as it is now, everything just looks so bland and boring outside of a very few number of levels. I'm hopeful though that the new levels in the upcoming DLC will freshen up the game experience. As it is now, too many bugs, glitches, and visual blandness take away from the game's sense of style. This game could have used another 6 months to a year to clean up some of these issues. It's another title that was rushed to market so that income could be collected for the company instead of taking the necessary time to release a truly finished product. It's unfortunately a sign of the world we live in, but it nonetheless takes away from this title. Back 4 Blood is very much a living game, and for all the criticism I've leveled at it in this video, I need to give it props for not launching as a meager experience. It was by no means a perfect launch because of the ongoing technical issues, but at least the game had a decent amount of content. This may not be a live service game in the strictest sense of the word, but there is plenty of additional content that's on the way. Turtle Rock has already launched a new update for the game in December and has promised more in 2022. This first major update delivered many solo features that the community has been calling for, along with some new supply lines and cards to experiment with. The game received a lot of flack for its always online requirements, and it appears Turtle Rock has heard the cries. In December, a solo offline mode was made available, and reward restrictions were removed for playing by yourself. No longer were supply points, trophies, and level progression locked behind online play, which is good. On top of that, many of the game's cards were rewritten for better balancing. Unfortunately, this did result in some of the game's better cards being nerfed or changed entirely. Looking ahead though, in 2022, Turtle Rock claims that brand new characters, cards, and campaigns will be added throughout the year. Hopefully these additions elevate the game further, but as I've mentioned throughout this video, content really isn't the core issue with Back 4 Blood. New content is nice, but hopefully Turtle Rock commits to working on some of the title's issues before going all in on the new content. It's hard to see that happening though, considering that they can charge players for more content, but not for patches that fix the bugs. There are concerns about this paid DLC though, for how it may fracture the community. Back 4 Blood is a title that's meant to be replayed repeatedly, and so it's safe to assume most players won't venture through the story once and then stop playing. The replayability is what makes this genre so popular, but sectioning off new content behind paywalls will leave some players behind if they choose not to pay. This has potential to break up squads who've been playing together for a while, but there really isn't a good solution to this problem. Honestly, I'd prefer paid DLC for new content instead of having an in-game shop where players could spend real-world money for cards or cosmetics. At least that way, every player is on the same footing. So yeah, I'm looking at you, Turtle Rock. Do not add an in-game shop. Regardless, only time will tell what the future holds for Back 4 Blood, but I feel more optimistic about this title's chances for success than any other live service game that we've seen in recent years. Throughout this lengthy critique, I've been hard on Back 4 Blood, but I want to end this video by saying it's out of tough love. I've really enjoyed playing this title not only for its satisfying gameplay loop, but also because it's the first online multiplayer game that's managed to sink its teeth into me in years, probably since Battlefield 1. Playing through this title with friends new and old has been a blast, and I've formed a lot of great gaming memories because of it. In short, Back 4 Blood is a lot of fun, and that remains its greatest strength. There's something tangibly satisfying about overcoming the apocalypse and surviving against all odds. It captures the power fantasy dynamic that video games do so well, and this triumphant feeling is only made more palpable when you win alongside of others. It's a loop that clearly resonates with a lot of people, myself included. And that's why I've been as harsh as I have throughout this video, because I want Turtle Rock to turn this title into something special, with future updates and patches. The core issues I've outlined will require an overhaul of many of the title's guts, but it would be well worth it. Reducing trauma damage and the respawn rate of Special Ridden would help stem the bleeding of the falling player count. Fleshing out the characters in future updates and providing new levels to explore would help in breathing life into this game world. And providing new cards and characters to use will provide a fresh experience for fans loving the game. Hell, by the time you're watching this, some of these changes might have already been implemented. Here's hoping anyway, because these core issues are quickly eating away at the game's player count. One look at the Steam chart tells us this game is dropping rapidly in favor of Left 4 Dead 2. If Turtle Rock can't course correct soon, there might not be enough players to continue pushing out updates. Hopefully Back 4 Blood can right the wrongs, and if it continues to improve, it very well may end up being the game from 2021 that I played the most in 2022. And to be honest with you, I wouldn't be upset at all if that were the case. Thanks for watching. Hey everyone, that brings us to the end of this critique of Back 4 Blood. I have to apologize real quick because during this last recording section, I do have a cold. I don't know if it came through in the video, but I imagine it did because most of it I sounded fine, and then this cold hit, but I had to finish this video and get it done, so sorry about that. Anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the game in the comments below, and I'd encourage you to check out some of my other lengthy critiques. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing for more, follow me on Twitter @NopeNapNarp, and as always guys, have a nice day, and take care.